we go once again.
Hello, Jack.
Hello, Dan.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing all
Carrying
right. The only thing I wanted to mention at the start of this week's episode is that we talked 2 weeks ago when we were recording our last one. We recorded on the Thursday, and then the episode went up on Friday, and we were joking about, like, nothing's ever going to happen to Donald Trump. Nothing's ever going to happen to this.
This jury's
court
never
case.
gonna.
Yeah, this jury's never going to come to a conclusion. And it was like 9 hours later,
Immediately,
they immediately come to a conclusion. They're like, oh, he's guilty on every single count, which is incredibly funny.
Yeah.
And then today they got our man Hunter Biden as well, unfortunately, on some gun
Very
charges.
sad.
So, you know, what are you gonna do?
I mean, that's not a story I've looked into. I mean, I've like it's entered involuntarily into my consciousness a few times, but it's just the most mad.
Yeah.
Like, it's just crazy. I don't know what's
The algorithm's like, you might be interested in Hunter Biden's gun charges, and you're like, yes, but I don't think I want to engage in this.
Yeah. No.
What are you gonna do? They're coming after
Anyway,
all of
so,
them.
I don't know. I don't have anything intelligent to say about Hunter Biden.
No, I don't think
I don't know anybody.
I don't think
has
that's
anything
of any
intelligent
consequence
say.
to the class struggle, Dan. So I think that we can just leave that one on the back burner.
Great.
What are you
My
gonna do?
algorithm did start throwing like weird, like Gamergate era men's rights activist
Jesus.
type shit at me again,
Oh,
which
God.
like I didn't realize it even existed, but there was clearly
Yeah.
there were still people doing that. So
Yeah, my
that was a peculiar blast from the past that I had recently.
yeah, it's like Neil Druckmann. Remember that guy? So I had to update, a bit of a backstory. I had to update I have a very old iPhone, and I just haven't updated the operating system in forever, because it gets to a certain point, if you've had a phone for like 5 or 6 years, if you update, it just fucks up the phone and it stops working. So I've been putting it off. But this last week, I had to update it to most recent one. So I just bit the bullet and I did it. My phone is actually more or less fine. But what it did was it updated all of my apps. So like all of my social media were like social media apps from like years ago. And then so it just suddenly updated. Like now all of a sudden I've got the new Twitter or whatever. And it's like so noticeably worse. It's just BuzzFeed. It's so funny. And to speak to your algorithm being like, you might be interested in, right-wing misogyny. Mine was like, just all of a sudden, the new Twitter algorithm on the new app was just like, I follow some weather accounts, and it was like, some guy that I don't follow, of course, was at the top of my feed and was like, here's a map of all of the extreme tornadoes and like weather events in the Midwest of the United States this year. What do you notice? And I was like, all right, like they got me. I'll click on it. Like, what is this? This is something about like climate change or whatever. And it was the guy immediately was just like government controlled weather events, I think. And I was just like, oh my God. I was like, I knew social media sucked, but like this is just like, it's just getting so bad.
I thought you were going to be in the rabbit hole then. I thought you were going to be sold.
And I'm like, yeah, the government's controlling tornadoes. Thank you, Elon Musk, for putting that at the top of my feed.
If only.
If only. I know. That's the thing. Yeah, so many of these things, it's like, if only the fucking ruling class had the capacity to act with any sort of like, I don't know if controlling and creating tornadoes is like a rational set of behavior set. If only they could do that.
Even if they had like super villain capabilities, it would speak something
exactly
toward their like capacities or capabilities. But no, zero. Great. I like the idea that you were like the last user of Twitter, you know.
I know. Also, well, it actually changed to X. I was
yeah. Yes, the last Marxist on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. It was just, it is just like conspiracy theory bullshit now. It's just like, wow, damn. The labor theory of value is true. That's what this has taught me. And that like technology like rents, just not profitable. So they have to keep just being like, make it BuzzFeed now. I don't know. Now put conspiracy theory bullshit in everybody's feeds.
Yes. Yeah. How can we forestall the final crisis, you know?
Government mandated weather events.
Update the graphic design of Twitter to X, and
I don't know what's more disturbing, that or the fact that it probably works.
Imagine if they were like creating tornadoes to destroy fixed capital in order to increase the rate of profit.
Oh my God. Pulmatic climate accelerationism. Wow, we've discovered a new vein. That's hilarious. I should have responded and said that. Look, they know they can't have a war because of nuclear weapons, so they're controlling the tornadoes. There's got to be like a Marxist out there that thinks that. That's so
this is my challenge to you, Jack, is to just to engage any all of those in a sort of campaign of trolling predicated purely on like Marxist theories of breakdown, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing, though, that I'm just feeding the algorithm.
Just the comment on every post is just, but what about the falling rate of profit?
Read your Heinrich Grossman. The government is controlling tornadoes. It couldn't be more obvious. The funny thing is that there were photos of like a destroyed Amazon warehouse, and I was like, So,
that's why Paul Matic went to live on a commune and grow vegetables. You know,
exactly.
He saw it coming. He saw it coming.
Yeah. Hey, crazier things have happened. I love it when people say that. Crazier things have happened. I don't think that they have than that.
No.
I don't think that they have.
No.
All right. I'm just gonna come out and say right off the bat, I struggled with this reading a lot more than the previous ones, and I think the reason for that is that it actually, I came into this book being like, explain everything about value that I was too afraid to ask, right? And now that we've gotten to this point, I'm kind of like, oh God, I think I might actually disagree with some of the stuff that's in this book. So it's put me in a really weird position of like having to figure out why. And so I think my confidence in terms of talking about this, maybe it's not so much that I struggled with this insofar as it just like opened up new avenues of like, oh God, I got to use my brain now to think about this. So
yeah, more new avenues for questions and answers, and
more questions. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. So yeah.
Why? Yes, I'm. I suppose we should say we're going to embark on what is it now, third effort to,
I think third, yeah.
Build a podcast episode around reading Isaac Rubin's essays on Marx's theory of value. Is that correct?
Something like that.
Something like that. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. It's the
one. It's the yellow book. Everybody knows.
And yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think that we're on an educational journey with this book, but obviously with attempting to understand the full importance, nuances, the ins and outs of all aspects of Marxist economics, and perhaps more importantly, what camps, what factions of the Marxist left does that put us in, and how do we feel about our new bedfellows? Yeah, I mean, I did enjoy this as ever. It's like tantalizing, and maybe this is my like government controls the weather kind of
intriguing
attitude. Well, no, just the kind of like the mystical knowledge is out there, like maybe it's not the government controls the weather, maybe it's totally a bit of like occultism, it's just like,
it is. Absolutely. I mean, I honestly, like, it would be silly of us to recognize how many people have insane ideas about trying to understand the way the world works under commodity production, because it's so impossible to understand on the surface level, and then not feel like that applies to us. You know what I mean? So like we have our sets of crazy ideas too.
So what always, I mean, in relation to that, what I always enjoy about this, a sort of return to Marx, a return to like early 20th century writing about Marx, but like one which is heavily referential of first-hand texts of Marx and Marx's contemporaries, is that like actually Marx was very close to the mainstream of political economy, like he in a lot of ways can be read as a fellow traveler, if not like a slightly advanced thinker on top of David Ricardo or Adam Smith or what have you. I feel like that's the one thing that I wish I could take to all contemporary crank critics of some kind of sort of like straw man concept of Marxism and communism, is that like, well, no, actually, like there is a rigorous schema underneath here. just because you and I don't necessarily understand
Yeah. Hey.
it.
Well, the thing is,
and
though,
my yeah.
that like straw man view that they have of Marx is very often something that's more akin to people that they would maybe praise, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. It's like when people go, "Oh yeah, Karl Marx, labor theory value guy." It's like, they can't really see what I'm doing, but I'm looking over my proverbial glasses right now.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think in the initially when I started reading these chapters, I was just like reading it totally removed from the elements of this book that we've read so far, and in some respects, I um, was enjoying this, at least the surface level appearance of this, almost somewhat more than I had been from the commodity fetishism sections, partly because I suppose it's um, uh, going back to referencing some very basic Marxist terminology, like the first chapter of the ones that we read. I guess I should say we started with the chapter on form and content, and read through to the last chapter we did. I think was on
Socially necessary labor time.
socially necessary labor. Yeah.
Mm, yeah.
And so that first chapter starts with a discussion of value versus exchange value. Uh, as I say, lots of references to like classical writers and Marx's various disagreements with contemporary economists. And also, what I also enjoyed about this section was I like what has come up quite a lot in this book, which I feel like I often don't encounter. Um, and what was heavily present in these chapters, I thought, was a reference to like the continuity between modes of production. Like he's very keen. Maybe this is something we can talk about in a little while, because I think there is at least some things that we can talk about for sure in reference to what he says about what socialism is and how he understands. I can't remember what the phrase is. Socially equated labor, kind of thing, like
Yeah.
as opposed to commodity
Abstract
and
labor.
market mediated abstract labor, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think there are things we might disagree with, predicated on readings we've made in the past. But yeah, that was my main takeaway. And then as I was re-looking at it today, I was realizing how this is an important follow-on from the chapters that we've read so far, right? So like what he quite famously does as a structure of this book is start with commodity fetishism, and really seek to center that idea. And we've covered this previously, like there's early chapters in this book when he sort of suggests that you should read chapter one of or section one of Capital backwards in some ways, so that you can. What he's doing is starting with commodity fetishism and working his way backwards. And I feel like there are some ways now where we've reached the beginning point. And he's ready to talk about value and use value and exchange value and the importance of centering and structuring Marx, a reading of Marx's political economy alongside and integrally with an understanding of Marx's historical materialism.
Hmm. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, in this book, you're right. Like, you get a lot of what you kind of seemingly don't get a lot of in Marx, which is a lot of like abstract labor, which is boom, 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 socially necessary labor, which is boom, boom, boom. And he just comes out and he says it. And then this book is all really structured really well, where at the beginning of every chapter goes over, summarizes what he talked about in the last one. And then he gets through it and he talks about, a bunch of different people. And I do think that maybe so far, having read this, the biggest, maybe the best contribution that this book has made, at least to me, is beginning with commodity fetishism. We talked about this in the earlier episodes. Is like centering that as this isn't just some side thing in Marx's value theory. This basically is Marx's value theory, right? It is the fact that you have to compare your labor to others through the commodity. It's the fact that commodities do this that is so central to the way that capitalism functions, right? It's that these social relations are mediated by things, not just that they are, but that they have to be under capitalism, under commodity production. And I think that that's really good. And I was really looking forward to getting to these bits. And there's loads of really good stuff in here. Like I know that I said early on that maybe there's some stuff that I disagree with. I think that stuff mainly centers around um, what he says about abstract labor and kind of like how he talks about, it's the historical nature of, or maybe the lack of the historical nature of abstract value, and how that kind of leads a lot of people to go back and read this book and have a reading of Marx that is closer to like value form theory stuff, closer to like value is produced in exchange kind of stuff, as opposed to value being realized in exchange, all of those kind of like esoteric arguments. But having said that, loads of good stuff in this book. And there's a lot of stuff in here that I either was reminded of from, the first read through of Capital that we did, of those first few chapters, and stuff that I just realized for the first time. So I'm kind of excited to get to that. Maybe we just begin, I guess. We were talking about this right before we started recording. I don't think we're going to do like a beat by beat thing of all of this for the listener. Go read it for yourselves. We're just going to pick, I think, on some things that are particularly interesting to us. And the first thing, at least for me, was he starts the section that we read by kind of doing a little bit of the third thing argument, which is something that's kind of always like, on one hand, I really like it and I really kind of appreciate it, because this is when you first read that first chapter of Capital of Marx's, you get this from Marx, this idea that he's criticizing all the other, it's the subtitle of the book, A Critique of Political Economy. He's criticizing all the other political economists that come before him. And he's saying that, you know, when you compare two commodities on the market, you're clearly not comparing their use values. You're clearly comparing something else that's going on. And Marx goes, this something else is labor, but it's not concrete labor. It's labor in the abstract, blah, 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 blah. And then he kind of goes off to the races. But Rubin here has a really interesting interpretation of that bit of Marx, because he says, yeah, that third thing argument, like that's kind of part of it. But he says that, I suppose, well, maybe I'll take another step back and just say that he's beginning this with a criticism of like maybe what you would call positivists in the economic realm, who basically just focus on the things that you can see. They focus on exchange value, right? And they go, the exchange value of a thing is what it's going to bring you, right? The exchange value is what you get when you exchange it, right? And of course, he says you could use Marx's third thing argument here to say, well, that's clearly not the case. But he actually says that that isn't the starting point for talking about value, because he says you need to have this stepping stone from exchange value to value. It's not like a logical step to just make that without proving why, right? So he says the starting point isn't that my sweater and my slippers have like, they can be equated on the marketplace using this third thing. He actually says that it's that all commodities can be equalized with all other commodities on the market with regularity. And that regularity is determined in production, which I thought was just like, oh, that's interesting. It kind of seems like a minor thing, a minor point that he's making. But he's actually basing Marx's whole argument and his logic on pretty much a lot of the same logic that most other political economists would have, which is just the basic functioning of a commodity economy, right? You can't exchange your thing for every other thing. Why is that? Not so much that this thing exchanges for that thing. What's the third thing? It's that everything can be exchanged with every other thing, right? Which is an interesting, I'm still kind of letting that compost in my brain in terms of why that's important and what it means. But it's definitely an interesting thing. And obviously he quotes Marx and he shows that this actually is what Marx is saying. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. I'm keen to know kind of what you made of that first section.
Yeah, I mean, so much. It's funny that like so much of this book is structured around refuting some criticism of Marx or explaining Marx's refutation of somebody else's interpretation, kind of thing. So it's sort of like coming back to that sort of a misreading, a straw man interpretation of Marx, which says that like, okay, we have a relationship of exchange, right? Like the commodity economy is a process of recurrent exchange relationships between different commodities. And one can either say, as the sort of like classical political economists did, and Marx sort of did as an extension of them, like this has to be in reference, there has to be some kind of substance that's being compared, and sort of classically that was identified as labor, and obviously like that has all kinds of complications if you're going to identify that purely as the concrete labor of an individual. And so sort of Marx has these additions that he makes. We'll come on to talk about um, uh, the nature of abstract labor, I think, in a little while, and maybe a little bit about um, socially necessary labor. But one of the criticisms that's often made of Marx here is that he's making a sort of quite an abstract and analytical type of argument, whereby like in his discussion of the comparison of commodities, as you say, what is being overlooked is not that he's saying, well, one commodity relates to another and it's out of that relationship that is emergent something's value, but rather a commodity actually relates to a whole web of other commodities. What Rubin says is, I think, coming back to the significance of identifying that, I think what Rubin is trying to say is that, like, actually, what Marx is doing is not making some kind of abstract argument. It's not a thought experiment. It's not like creating a simplified version of the economy from which it is possible for him to extract his own particular understanding of what exchange value is, which people might be arguing that like he's conjuring from a form of analytic argument rather than creating from a concrete assessment of material situations. I think the significance of Rubin bringing up the fact that Marx is actually talking about exchange value as a web of exchange relationships between any one commodity and every other commodity in the economy is to actually say Marx isn't making an abstract argument. What he's doing is starting from a premise of the real economy as it exists. And the reason why I think Rubin always like heads back to this point is what I was saying before about it being necessary to understand Marxist political economy through the framework, in some respects, of historical materialism, and the nature of the economy as a series of social relationships, and rather than being sort of like one arbitrary example of exchange, actually, when a commodity meets when a producer of commodities interacts with the market, what they're actually doing is establishing a whole series of social relationships, and in that process, a there is emergent a sort of process for equating all labor with all other labor, and without it being a conscious thing, there's sort of like an algorithmic process which generates an actual social equivalency between forms of labor. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're definitely right, obviously, to center the social relations in all of this. Um, and I think that, that's probably the reason, to kind of go off topic here for a second, that like so many Marxists now are interested in systems theory, right? Or I hope so many Marxists now are interested in systems theory. Like when we spoke to June, she talked all about this, about how she was like, I think Marx would have been very much down with like systems theory and cybernetics, right? Because that kind of, she made the point when we spoke to her, she was like, that's just kind of what he was talking about. And at the time, I don't think I really understood fully what that meant. But it is true, right? It's like when you study modes of production, you are studying the relationships that humans have with each other. And I think whenever you get confused when you're reading about value theory, you do kind of need to come back to that point of like, what is it that's actually important here? It is the relationships that humans have to each other. And especially when you're engaging in some kind of political project, right, where you're trying to like utopianize the future, you need to be recognizing like, well, are you actually changing the social relations, or are you just getting rid of the market, or are you just getting rid of money, right? Which I think is probably something that we'll come on to here in a second. But in terms of the social relations again, I mean, he jumps to this, right? And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but he basically starts asking the question as well of like, why is it that human labor, I don't know, social labor, he says, right? I don't want to use the term abstract labor because that's fairly controversial in this book, but social labor, why is it that social labor takes on this form of value when you have commodity production, right? And seemingly, like Marx talks about how it can't just be that you have a division of labor, right? He uses the example of the quote unquote traditional Indian village, whatever that means, where he's like, look, you had a division of labor, but you didn't really have, value production, right? You didn't have uh, emergent property of the social relations of the time where there was this feedback mechanism of value kind of regulating the economy. And you even had class, right? Because he talks about the caste system. Um, but it's kind of important to recognize that what Rubin is here is saying, and what Marx, of course, is saying, and this is like, if you take anything, I think, from value theory, this is the most important thing. Human labor takes the form of value only where private property and production for exchange exists, right? Which is to kind of just say, you could maybe just say private property, because exchange, at least for me, is kind of like, yeah, if everybody's, producing in private production firms, you're going to need to have a mode of like, exchange, which, or a mode of distribution or whatever, which is exchange. Um, and I think that, this is pretty clearly like the most important part. And Rubin makes the point that like previous political economists figured it out. They figured out that value, they figured out the content of value kind of to a certain extent, right? They figured out that the content of value was labor. They might not have made this distinction of the twofold aspect of human labor that Marx did, which was one of his most important contributions to political economy, but they kind of got there. What they failed to see, though, is that commodity, human labor, basically, social labor, only takes the form of value when you have production for exchange and private property relations. I mean, again, I think that this is probably something that we've talked about before on the show, but it is, I think, important to keep harping on, right? Because this is what makes capitalism capitalism, commodity production commodity production. It's the fact that, there's this division of labor, but the fact that everybody produces all of these different things in private enterprises, and they are not producing those things solely for personal use, right? Because you could have private property or whatever, and if you didn't have exchange, you'd just be like a peasant living in the middle of nowhere, right? Making all of your own shit. But, this is the important thing. And this is the thing that you need to be comparing your imagined, wouldn't this be great, neurotic socialist society in your head to, when you're trying to create that world, right? Like, does private property exist? Does exchange exist? Because if it does, then human social labor, I'll keep saying, is going to take the form of value.
I think at risk of identifying my gross ignorance, I because so much of this first chapter that we read, it's obviously the title is form and content of value, and actually what he does is sort of like creates this or describes a sort of like tripartite system, although he sort of cleaves off one portion of it, right? So he spends some time talking about the form of value, he spends some time talking about the substance of value, he spends some time talking about the magnitude of value, and he's quite content and happy to like say that the substance of value is labor, as we've just talked about, although what type of labor is something that he goes on to talk more about. And obviously he identifies that substance as being in relation to the content of value. And he sort of like sort of cleaves off the idea of magnitude, right? So like labor is the substance of value. It, in some respects, what is value, although he is at pains to say, and I'm not really sure I can explain exactly why, but he's at pains to say that like value and labor are not direct equivalents. And he sort of like, he puts to one side the magnitude of value being labor time, a sort of quantitative aspect of this. Like, okay, so labor is the substance of value. It is, in some respects, what value is made of, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how much value is in a thing, and for that you need some measure of the quantity of labor that's gone into making a thing. And then the mysterious third thing, elephant in the room, which he's sort of like trying to work his way toward explaining, is what is the form of value. And when I was just rereading this first chapter, I kind of ended up just broadly equating the form of value to basically everything that you just said, right? Like all of those social relationships, all of those conditional things that are the result of the emergence of capitalism out of feudalism through this process of the development of history, understood through historical materialism. It's all of those features, all of those social features that I took to be representative of the form of value. I'm sort of putting that to you, but I'm also
I mean,
just putting that to the
honestly,
audience as being the point where I'm now at in
do
my
your own
general effort
research.
to understand what is meant by the
I
form of value.
I am really confused about this.
Mhm.
Because there are a lot of there's not term slippage, obviously, but there's a lot of incredibly similar terms, right? And so going into this, I just assumed that the value form of a given commodity is just its exchange value. And that can be a million different things. And so I was always like, oh, that's what value form is. That's what it is. But that is different than the form of value. Am I correct?
I don't know, but then the exchange value we were just saying is like broadly representative of um, a sort of like fully social network of one commodity's relationship to all other commodities, and therefore one commodity produces social relationship to all other commodity producers, kind of thing. Um, so, in some respects, therefore, that an argument, an interpretation of the form of value being its exchange value could also be analogous to its like sort of a general
True.
interpretation of the social relationships necessary to
I thought you were
maintain
going to
a
say
capitalist economy.
I thought you were going to say that interpretation of it leaves something to be desired. No, I was going to be like fair.
Yeah.
So okay, so I think
Anyway,
I think from here we should maybe get into the abstract labor stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot to say about this because this is the controversial chapter in this book, and it is the part of the book that has seemingly spawned a lot of the value form stuff. Um, let's just begin it where he begins it. So he begins it by talking about the idea of, is abstract labor physiological labor in some sense or not? And this was the first bit that I was really surprised about, because he takes great pains, this is someone else that he's arguing with, to be like, abstract labor is not physiological labor. It just isn't, you know. And my reading of the first parts of Capital doesn't really jive with that. Like, my understanding of it is that when you go to work, you're doing concrete labor, but you're also engaging in the abstract labor of society, right? My understanding of it then is that there is a physiological element to it. And maybe this is just way too simple, and I'm kind of worried that it is, but it's like, if it's not physiological in some way, what is it? Is it just this thing that doesn't exist other than in our minds? You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, there's concrete labor, but then there's this other thing that kind of doesn't really exist other than in this real abstraction in the process of exchange. I don't know. I need to talk this through with you, I think, because that first bit I was like, well, surely there's like, I'm doing abstract labor, you know what? Not podcasting, but like, I'm doing some kind of abstract labor when I go to work, right? Like, it is part of it. Maybe this is where we just need to read Hegel, which isn't going to happen, but you know.
um, well, and now trying to formulate my own response to that, I'm realizing all the patches in my understanding. But this was the one thing that I found really interesting. At least I found it clarifying, but I didn't really know it was something that needed clarifying. So in that sense, how clarifying can it really be? Um, I didn't find it provoking or problematic. It's funny when we read when we made our attempt to read and then talk about in a public forum the first chapter or the first section of Capital.
Which we finished when we read the primitive accumulation stuff.
Yeah. Done it, yeah. I'm pretty sure that we did read that sentence where Marx seemingly, and according to Isaac Rubin, does. If you were to just read those sections from chapter 1 of volume 1 of Capital, it's very easy to come away with the interpretation that okay, concrete labor is a specific type of labor that makes a specific type of commodity, or rather, maybe we should say a particular type of useful object, and that labor is that concrete labor is related to the concrete use values of that thing, and in some respects, like concrete labor is understood to be like a real world material. I don't know, like engaging the substance of the world kind of thing. And if you take an interpretation of the distinction between concrete and abstract labor purely from that first section of Capital, you come away with the idea that abstract labor is just sort of like generalized human labor. It's like it's the same thing, but like we're just abstracting away from the concreteness of it, the specificity of what the labor does, and generalizing a certain set of features of what it is to do labor in general. And they are some expenditure of like physical energy, some engagement of like muscular movement, I suppose, like creating some kind of sort of almost like just some collection of definitional terms that it's possible to then describe labor as in some kind of abstract way. Now, Rubin is saying that, like, yes, this is what Capital says, but if you read around that, if you read other things from Marx, you come away with a different interpretation. I mean, the thing that appealed to me about this was that, like, if you take that distinction, abstract labor is purely physiological. It allows you to say that that distinction between concrete and abstract labor exists throughout all of history. It means that there's nothing specific to capitalism about, or rather, it means that Marx is not trying to say something specific about the capitalist mode of production by introducing this piece of terminology, abstract labor. And Rubin is trying to stop us from having that interpretation, I guess. He's saying, no, Marx means something very specific. Abstract labor only exists under capitalism, and Marx means something very specific by abstract labor.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. I mean, I like. It's hard for me to come down too critically on this kind of proto value form stuff for reasons that we'll get to in a bit, like when we kind of draw out the conclusions, because I can kind of see how you choose one fork in the road and you go one way. But I like Rubin here. It seems like his logic is like, it's like the meme, you know, where it's like one person says something and they just do it's like they do a gymnastics flip, and then the other person, shut the fuck up. They do, like, you know, they go over a pummel horse and then they go over on the monkey bars and they do this, and it's all of these crazy like logical leaps that they have to do. It seems like if you just say abstract labor is an expenditure of human labor power as such, or it's human labor as such, it's just really simple. But what Rubin's trying to do here, I think, was he basically, I wrote this down. This is my note that I said in order to make myself sound smart, where he says that in order to reconcile how different concrete labors are performed, Rubin creates three different types of equal labor. And this is a bit later on. He says, okay, there's physiologically equal labor. Yeah, sure. There's socially equalized labor, and there's abstract labor, which just seems like, but to me, like, I don't know, abstract labor is just the generalized expenditure of part of the total labor power that society has, right? Or the total labor force that society has. And it kind of seems really complicated for him to introduce these other concepts that mean, to me, at certain points, just the same thing as abstract labor. It's like, physiological or not, I was kind of like taken aback by that bit. It's like, this is just a part. I understand abstract labor to just be a section of that total labor that society has available to it. And if you take that definition, as you're saying, of course it exists all throughout history, right? It's just about the specific forms that that labor takes under given social relations, which is kind of what we were saying, right? Like, in capitalism, this type of labor takes the form of value producing labor uh, because of private property and for production for
Well,
exchange.
well, well, maybe all we need to do then is say, well, okay, and the term that Marx gives to that form of
Yeah.
value producing labor is abstract labor. Like,
That's what I think. Yeah,
yeah,
it
yeah,
seems like maybe that just makes everybody happy. I don't know. Probably
yeah. I mean,
not.
I don't think. I think what Rubin is doing in clarifying that argument is to say people who are criticizing aspects of Marx are misunderstanding what Marx is saying. Like, I don't recall, and I haven't made notes on what particular critique of Marx Rubin is trying to rebut with this argument, right? But like, um, but what it what it is that he's trying to do, I think, ties into the general thrust of this book, which is to say, we like for in order to have a functioning capitalist economy, you have to have a some mechanism for equating human labor. And under capitalism, that happens in a very specific way. Um, and there is this sort of like definitional separation between. I think maybe this is the important thing because vis-a-vis other modes of production, right? And it's interesting because he does go through in very sketchy and vague terms um, what this how this relationship exists in other modes of production, but um, it is a constituent feature of capitalism, which is emergent from capitalism functioning as um, a mode of production whereby production is carried out privately by private producers and then has to be brought together and through some mechanism shown to be social, kind of thing. It has to be made to be social. And like we've talked about this multiple times, and Rubin talks about this loads in the earlier stages of this book, and that's the whole point of his starting with commodity fetishism, identifying um, the reification aspect of commodity fetishism, i.e., like commodities being believed to have a certain quality within them that is value, which Rubin and Marx are saying is mistaken, right? The value doesn't exist in the commodity. Um,
Well, I think what you're leading to, I think, is the next step of his argument, which is that he basically says that this act of abstraction of human labor, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but he says that it takes place in the act of exchange, right? And he's saying that, well, maybe he isn't necessarily saying this, but a lot of people that have read this book and agreed with this definition of abstract labor have then gone on to say, well, then it would seem as though value is created in exchange, because if this abstraction of labor is taking place in exchange, then that's where you're getting your price. That's where the price is formed. That's where the value is like seemingly just created. There you go. But I think that maybe a different interpretation of that, and one that we've come across before, is value is created and labor is abstracted prior to the act of exchange, right? It's created in the act of production, right? And this gets into the, well, is abstract labor physiological or not? Because if it is, then you could easily just say, oh, yeah, that person who's making those shoes is doing physiological abstract labor in some sense. And so there you go. They're creating their value because that is the content of value, right? I think the tricky thing comes, and this is something that I'm still kind of like trying to come to terms with. I sent you a Marxist Humanist podcast for an episode where Kleiman was just like laying into this value form guy, and in a particularly like funny way. And I don't necessarily know where I come down on this question. It's just that like I could see people being confused because if you believe that the value and that labor's abstraction and everything is done in production, then you're going to have to reckon somehow with the fact that you can create a commodity and its value is one thing when you create it, and then some time passes and you go to the market and its value is then suddenly different. Because the value form people and maybe Rubin would come around and say, well, there you go. That's proof that the value is only created in exchange. Whereas my reading of Marx has always been, no, it's created in production. It's just that there's no one and final value. The values of things are just constantly changing, and that there's like this temporal step between production and exchange. And I can see hearing that reading and the value formers being like, I don't know if I fully buy that, just because maybe to them it seems like a bit of a reach that you could have, are you saying that it's only the value is only realized and exchanged, or are you really just saying that the value is actually created in exchange? I think that that's kind of like the logical conclusions that a lot of people have taken from this book, and specifically from this chapter. And when I first started this chapter, and he spends all this time talking about physiological labor, at first I was a bit confused. Like, why would you start there? But then if the logical endpoint of all of this is that this abstraction of human labor happens in exchange, you necessarily come to some pretty like big conclusions, not just economically, I think, but politically, which maybe at some point we can get into.
I think that Rubin is quite clearly, he's aware that there might be an interpretation that says value is created purely in the moment of exchange and doesn't exist before that. It doesn't have some relationship to the production process. And I think he's at pains to deny that interpretation. Is that?
Yeah, I
Would you?
think
Yeah,
so. I think
yeah.
that the confusion though comes from how that squares up with him saying that abstract labor is, I don't want to say the word created, but that like labor is abstracted in the process of exchange. Because then it's like, well, if you think that, then maybe shouldn't you just take the next step and just say that the value is necessary? Like, people, I think, hassle him for that. You know what I mean? Where I think
Oh,
that you're right though in terms of what he's
well,
saying.
okay, yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, I just think that's probably unfair.
I don't
and
know. I think that they're like, if abstract labor isn't this thing that people do, and it necessarily like only exists under capitalism, and it necessarily only comes into play in the act of exchange and not in production, I could I could think you could make a pretty easily like criticize that view as saying that that necessarily leads to something where value was created in exchange.
So I maybe I should try and finish off saying what I was trying to say before. I think why it's important to um, emphasize like the entire structure. I feel like the structure of the argument that he's trying to make is that we have a social economy which is not like where production is not socially directed, but it's done privately. And then there has to be some kind of mediation between these two elements. And abstract labor exists in a capitalist economy to allow for all of that privately conducted labor and the sort of like commodities that are the result of that to be exchanged. And I feel like that's all that he's trying to say. I mean, it might be possible for one to sort of take, I guess, take that interpretation. I don't think that's. I don't think that's. Uh, it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't worry me in the same way. I don't think.
Yeah, I do think though that like, if I think that you could poke holes in an argument that says, oh, abstract labor is only realized through exchange, but not value. I don't necessarily see how that follows. You know what I mean? Like, I appreciate that he is trying to center production in all of this. But when he starts talking about how, abstract labor only exists under capitalism and how abstract labor is realized through exchange, I maybe all I'm saying is that it does seem like it's like a hop, skip, and a jump from there to value is created in exchange, which isn't necessarily what he's saying. But like maybe if you were to draw out some of his conclusions, maybe that is what he's saying. Um, yeah, I'm not sure.
Hmm. I'm I'm uh, I'm caught actually in a moment of like, here's a nice quote. Do I want to try and read it and I don't know,
Dissect it.
substantiate? Yeah, how would
Yeah,
I
go for it.
dissect it afterwards? I mean, I don't know whether well, I don't know whether it doesn't really prove very much other than um, proving what it is that Rubin is intending to say or intending to have us understand. Um, doesn't necessarily say that um, one couldn't have that interpretation. One couldn't come away with the feeling, but he does say some critics may say that our conception may lead to the conclusion that abstract labor originates only in the act of exchange. From which it follows that value also originates only in exchange. However, from Marx's point of view, value, and thus all abstract labor, must already exist in the process of production. Um, and then later on, he talks about the various ways in which because a producer isn't, because I guess similar to like all products being equated to all other products, and not being and their value not being demonstrated purely through a relationship to one commodity. Similarly, the production of commodities done by a producer is not a singular exchange with the market. Like any producer is under constant feedback pressure from the market. They're quite intentionally producing commodities um, with sale in mind, and they sort of know what the market rate is for things. They know that things are likely to sell. Um, his and therefore, like, even in the act of production, um, all producers are always minded toward the present existence of the market and what the value of the things that they're producing are. They know in some degree what the value is at any present time and are producing with that in mind, kind of thing. Um, so I think he's trying at least to like break away from an argument from a simplistic understanding of what Marx is saying as being, here is a producer isolated who knows nothing about the value of the commodity he has up until the point where he sort of meets the market and tries to exchange it. But actually, producers have much more knowledge, and sort of like market information permeates into the production process. Um, Again, that doesn't necessarily say that the commodity has value pre-existing within it. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, part of it is just, you're right, because part of it is just like a bickering over the exact semantics of the word realized when it comes to exchange, because there isn't anyone that's read any amount of value theory that would disagree with the fact that value is realized in exchange, right? There are people who would say, well, actually it's created in exchange, which is wild. But I mean, I don't know, it's only wild, I think, if you're trying to like have a like good faith understanding of Marx, which you don't have to do by any means. But like, yeah, value is, of course, you're not, if you make a bunch of shit and then you just sit on it, it doesn't matter how intensively you hassled your workers to make that shit, you're not going to realize that value until you actually like sell it. And you're not going to and yeah, to a certain extent, some corporations can do like market research and try and try and do accounting for labor time and figure out what the socially necessary labor time of any given commodity actually is. But they're never going to actually know until they get to the market, because that's constantly changing, right? Yeah, that's the one thing. I guess to go back the other way, like that's the one thing that has always just kind of confused me a little bit about like more Kleiman-y understandings of value, is that like what I was saying about a thing not having one set value. And it makes sense to me, this idea that like you make something and then the given, socially necessary labor time for its production changes. And so when you try to go to the market, it's not the value that it actually had under production. Um, But like I said, I could easily see value theory people being like, well, then that, or not value theory, value form people being like, well, then you say that's just me being right. Of course, this social relation is really only certified through exchange. So I don't know. It is what it is. This stuff. I don't feel particularly dogmatic one way or the other.
um, do you? Because I don't know a huge amount about value form theory. I don't think you know much more than I do.
I could pretend.
Well, yeah. Well, I was wondering whether, like, why it is that someone might choose that interpretation, I guess.
I mean, I think it's just kind of what I'm saying about like, what does it mean to actually have the value of a commodity be realized? You know what I mean? I could see, I could see somebody being like, well, if it's you only actually get the value in exchange, if it's only actually verified, then if the abstract labor is if this abstraction of labor only happens in the exchange process, then maybe the value is actually created in exchange to some certain extent, right? I mean, I do think that when people talk about value form theory, it gets memed on a little bit because I think that there aren't a whole lot of value form people who would just come right out and say value is created in exchange. I think they have what they call some sort of like co-constitutive theory of value, where like, well, it's created in production, but like actually exchange is the thing. I think honestly, like it's worth keeping in mind the purpose of all of this, which is to understand the functions of a commodity economy so that you can then understand how to properly build a socialist economy, right? Um, I think the only time the value form stuff where it, and its focus on this idea of general exchangeability and of the value form of a thing being the most important part of this process. I only think the only time that really becomes a big issue is when they start to draw political conclusions from it, because a lot of the time it is just get rid of the market. You know what I mean? If the market is such a big part of the capitalist production process, if exchange is such a big part of this production process, and that's where this abstraction happens, then surely if you just got rid of market competition and you just planned everything would be fine, right? It leads to these ideas that are a little bit bourgeois in their understandings of what socialism should be, which is just take all of the irrationality out of capitalism, right? Which kind of like isn't necessarily the point. Like some people would even maybe say that capitalism in the way that value functions is rational and that it's rational for the capitalists. I don't think I'd go quite so far as to say that, especially when something like value is like actively destroying the environment with which we all inhabit, even capitalists. But I see what people would be saying about that. Like the issue isn't that the capitalist production process is, irrational or whatever. The issue with the capitalist production process is that private property exists in the first place and that labor is alienated, right? So I don't know. I maybe this is just an issue of everybody reading what they want to read into Rubin, because I, like you, was also surprised. I was kind of expecting this to just be like him just coming out and being like, the value form. I'm a value form guy. Value is created in exchange. And as you're saying, he certainly doesn't do that. It's just that certain things about the way that he treats abstract labor create a base upon which people can do that. And I don't really know enough about this stuff to really like hassle people one way or the other. I just think that the litmus test for your value theory for someone like me is what are the political conclusions you draw from it, right? Because those political conclusions need to be de-alienate labor and get rid of private property. It's, as we've said before in the show, just figure that out and then everything else will be fine. You don't need to worry about anything else.
I guess the reason why his line of argumentation appeals to me is because it sort of chimes so much with what we've read ages and ages and ages ago about from Brenner and Woods, and
I was going to ask you
the
about this because to me it
historical
kind of does.
specificity of. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, at least to the extent that he's championing the. Well, actually, you're correct. Actually, there are parts of this that I was reading where he was clearly almost developing something akin to a teleological understanding. Like there are certain developmental aspects, but at least to the extent that he's arguing for it being necessary to talk of the historic specificity of capitalism, that was that sort of piqued my interest, and the reason why I was saying earlier, like that interpretation of abstract labor was clarifying to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly still a bit confused about his interpretation of abstract labor for the reason I was mentioning like earlier, which is he says that abstract labor only exists under capitalism, but then he gives a definition for a type of abstracted labor. He doesn't use that term; he uses different terms that existed all throughout human history, which has always just been my understanding of what abstract labor
Mhm.
is. So part of me
Well,
is
like
like, I'm just confused by that.
I don't know, like in some ways, in some way, you just reminded me that one thing that he actually almost implies is that like not only should you draw a distinction between um, abstract labor as a general a sort of generalized term to describe non-specific labor, which is physiological in nature, just relates to the mechanics of human beings and human brains and their relationship to the engaging the world. So there's that sort of like um, a historical description, and then there's the abstract labor that we've just been talking about, like specific to capitalism, um, emergent from specific capitalist social relations and what it was the commodity the is necessary to have a commodity economy. But he almost implies that um, actually that a historical understanding of abstract labor doesn't actually exist throughout history, at least to the extent that um, in many other modes of production, and this sort of made sense to me, and in many other modes of production, like it would actually be anathema to even recognize an equivalence between all types of human labor. Like, um, can you imagine like the a feudal king recognizing an equivalence between what their physical capabilities are and like sort of the lowest serf in whatever uh,
Yeah,
feudal holding, I guess, like or
it
like
still is
the
though.
it's the same. It comes. I mean, I suppose it is the case that yeah. I mean, yes, it is. Um, but in terms of the operation of the mode of production, it
Sure,
doesn't.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's worth pointing out that it doesn't hold true, and it's almost a creation of bourgeois, like it's a creation of bourgeois society that the notion, but like liberal bourgeois society, the notion that um, all people are equal and all labor is equal, I guess.
Yeah. Well, but then I think that gets into maybe one of the last things we can talk about, which is this idea of what he calls qualified labor, which I think I've always just understood as this idea of like complex labor,
Yeah.
right? Um, this is something, you know, you say that that's like the bourgeois ideal that like everybody's labor is created equal, but like in bourgeois political economy, it's very much not treated as that, right? Um,
But you could, but one person could do any type of labor.
one person could do any type of labor, yeah, but I think like yeah, there is a general replaceability or whatever of labor, but I think that when actual like bourgeois economists try and understand this idea of complex versus simple labor, their brains break because to them, how do you equate someone who's a neurosurgeon with someone who's a low-level administrator to pick a random job pertaining to nothing? And here, Rubin does a good job of explaining how that happens, right? Because he's basically saying, if we take Marx's theory of value for granted, how then can, if it's a measure of labor time, how then can two different types of human labor who, you know, on average give the same amount of labor time to a commodity, how then can they create different types of value? And he basically says that it's because of this idea of simple versus complex labor, where there's kind of like a multiplier in terms of skilled work, right? Quote unquote, like skilled work. Like the idea that, I don't know, it has, it takes society longer to reproduce a doctor than it does a someone who works in retail, right? And so it's that quality of the labor that makes it impart more value onto a given product. I think that is a pretty important point. The political conclusions of that kind of stuff, though, I always get a bit wary of just because it leads Rubin, among a lot of other people, to argue for wage differentials under socialism, even when he's talking about labor certificates, which I'm kind of like, oh, God damn it, like you shit the bed there. But maybe that's just because he's writing in the Soviet Union. And I don't know, what are you going to do? Not write that. But it is worth clarifying in a theory of value, that simple and complex labor impart different values onto a product, but then also that it's not just a moral category, right? Like nobody's saying that, like, I don't know, like street sweepers are like simpletons. And that is in fact a very bourgeois interpretation of what Marx is saying. It's just, it has to do with the amount of time it takes to recreate that specific labor, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I was quite interested in that because when we, way back when, as I say, when we read Capital, I remember being quite confused by that distinction of like simple and complex labor that Marx talks about, and basically all complex labor being breakdownable into units of simple labor. But I guess it's just like, as you say, like a multiplier. Like the work of a doctor is worth 3 units of simple labor to their 1 hour of complex qualified labor or whatever. It's interesting. Like, maybe it's worth sort of trying to state what it is that Rubin thinks the difference is between capitalism and socialism. Like, obviously, what Rubin wants to overcome is the reification inherent in commodity production and sort of the alienation that comes from that, and the general, but basically overcome private commodity production and make all production social. He's saying that under capitalism, you have to have this market process. You have to have the existence of things like abstract labor to do the work of, one, creating a general exchangeability between the products of labor, but also undergoing a market process to prove that any commodity, any product of work is actually representative of some kind of like social wealth. You have to prove that it fits into the social pool of things necessary for the reproduction of society. Obviously, for Rubin under socialism, like that abstraction is going to be overcome, and production is going to be consciously and socially directed. I feel like that's a fairly uncontroversial definition for what socialism is, I suppose. What's fun in this is sort of like, he doesn't really explain how this process will be done. He's just hypothesizing the creation of some kind of like socialist unit of labor, like this sort of like socialist brain, whether it's like I'm not even sure whether he's imagining central planning or some kind of like sort of like uh councilist style, like bottom up systems theory understanding of the organization of economy, but like he's just sort of hypothesizing some hypothetical unit, and then, as you say, he's imagining that, okay, a doctor's label will be recognized as being like 2 times the basic labor rate kind of thing. And I was a bit frustrated by that one, because it, like, I mean, maybe it's not the thrust of his book to try and lay out some kind of definition for how a socialist economy will actually function, but he really seems to stray into like wild abstraction in a way which feels unhelpful, I guess.
Yeah.
and that he does fall into this trap of saying, well, or he doesn't go down the route of saying, actually what we'll do is we'll just force the system such that we'll just by fiat decide that an hour of any labor is equivalent to the hour of any other kind of thing, and build your system off of that basis. But rather, but maybe it is, as you say, he's writing under the censors of the Soviet censor, and doesn't want to rock the boat too
Yeah.
much. And maybe he is a secret council list.
Hey, he could be. I mean, it's funny, right? Because he's tricky in that he will be like, maybe he's just not tricky. Maybe this is just how we should all write. He's like, and then the planning body will decide this. And I was ready to be like, the planning body, you centralized planning motherfucker. But then I was just like, you can take that as literally what you're saying, like
Whatever.
anything. Like that just means that could be the ledger. You know what I mean? The only other thing to say on the wage differential stuff is that, other than I think kind of like missing the point about what socialism is to me in maybe a bit more of a philosophical way, the reason I don't really appreciate wage differentials is put into a socialist system is that like it would be pretty difficult to actually figure that out, and in terms of like to justify why it is that a doctor gets 2.75 labor hours and not 2.74. Like it just seems like that would just lead to such class, I suppose, like discontent. And who's deciding this, as opposed to if you just put it generally in the like general labor hour and in the general ledger and just go, hey, here's how much time it took to train up all these doctors, just slap it there.
I mean, I guess the problem is not that you would. I mean, this is not what you're saying. It's my misunderstanding of what Rubin is saying, I think, or rather, I don't know. It's clarifying for me to realize that it's not necessarily a bad feature of socialist accounting to try and differentiate between labor, but then to let that be carried over into how people are recompensed. What portion of the social product they have access to for consumptive purposes. I guess that is what he's saying that should happen, and that's the bit that we have problem with, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you could, if the socialist state planner has some workable metric way to calculate that stuff,
to figure that
why
out.
the hell not? Yeah. Or the socialist state supercomputer run by like AI,
the guy from the Matrix,
yeah.
The architect.
Yes.
There you go. Well, and then there's a chapter on socially necessary labor, which is
kind
of just exactly what you know what it is. Yeah, exactly. So there you go. You can figure that one out for yourselves. It is in the name. This is good. This is really good stuff. Like I said, it's kind of left me with a lot more questions, and it's left me on slightly like more uneven ground than I thought that I was on with value theory, just because it has opened me up to like this idea of when is it that this abstraction is actually taking place. I'm still quite keen to say that it does actually take place in production. It's just that all of these things are realized in exchange, but it has opened me up to the idea of like maybe that abstraction does actually occur in exchange, and just made me realize that there's no point in being dogmatic. You know what I mean? There's no point in like hassling people. It's like, I don't know. Sure, man.
I feel like this has been like a tricky episode, and it's difficult subject matter. I think this is the most fun I've had trying to wrestle with something that I don't understand in a way that feels productive. Despite anything else, any other inaccuracies, any other confusions, any other misunderstandings, any other disagreements, it's reminding me how worthwhile it is just to wrestle with these things out loud.
Yeah, absolutely.
With a more or less willing audience.
Well, I don't mean you, obviously.
Yeah, more or less captive.
The thing to me that is so fascinating about all of this is at times I'm just so willing to be like, whatever, you have your interpretation, I can have mine. But the thing that's so fascinating is the actual political conclusions of all of this stuff. And it seems just like the slightest difference in people's belief will, I mean, this could be obvious, will cause them to have a completely different political outlook.
Well, it might be the other way around. It's their political outlook that's making them seek specific beliefs, you know.
Which sect got its claws into you first? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe that's why I'm more confused than most people that come to this stuff. It's because like I've just never been part of a sect. And so coming to a lot of this stuff, I'm just like, tell me what to think. I just need to know.
I mean, this is also why we always agree with the last thing that we've read.
Exactly.
And this is why this is so unnerving to us, is because we don't know how to. This is the first one where we don't really know how to process it.
We've been challenged. Oh God, the facade is slipping after 100 episodes. Yeah. Well. All right. Well, we have one more section to read of this book. I actually haven't really looked ahead too much to know what it is. I'm interested to know if this is where he's going to have some sort of like dun 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 dun, and then here's my conclusion. But it seems like we've kind of already come to that, so I'm interested to know a little bit more. We got to find some more stuff about abstract labor, what the fuck it is, and specifically its historic component, or maybe the lack thereof, because that is something that I find really interesting. Because now I am just questioning my basic understanding of abstract labor, which is just human work,
world shaking.
Yeah, I will say, when the one interpretation, Oh God, the one interpretation of the physiological stuff that has always been a bit weird to me is when people start being like, it's human labor as such. It's the muscles of the human. It's the bones moving. It's like, I don't know. That doesn't. Maybe that's going a bit too far. I don't know about that. It's the expenditure of energy. It's like I don't expend very much energy at my job these days. So what are you gonna do? Anyways.
Yeah, I agree. Let's find that out. Also, maybe it's worth trying to work out what value form theory is, at least from my standpoint, anyway.
What is it? What does it do?
What is it?
What can I do with it?
Well,
all right.
Good stuff.
Good stuff,
If
Dan.
If anybody is still listening, God bless you.
God bless you.
And thank you for this, John.
Thank you for this, Dan. We'll be back for another episode in 2 weeks. See y'all later. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.